welcome everyone. I'm really happy that we're here today to talk about the city of Antwerp and some of its issues in housing and in making the city. Antwerp has an incredibly rich history. It was one of the wealthiest cities in the 16th century and highly progressive at the time. And it developed into a very competitive 19th century industrial harbor city. And today, it still has a wealth of historical architecture, contemporary architecture, and an urban structure and strategic plan that combines the values of the historical and the contemporary city. As such, we've kind of gotten together a conversation here that's based on both the historical and the contemporary qualities of Antwerp, as well as the challenges it faces as a European mid-sized city for the 20th century. The European mid-sized city is fairly specific, and it has many valuable qualities that make it a desirable place to live. Some of these features are clearly distinct from large-scale urban areas. Most European mid-sized cities are fairly compact, between 500,000 and 1 million inhabitants. They're typically quite connected by road, air, rail, water, and they typically have a high quality of life rating. Historically, they usually have a clear identity, but their urban and social and architectural configurations have been steadily changing since the middle of the 20th century. And some of these cities, like Antwerp, also have features more typically associated with larger metropolitan areas, such as a very uneven economic and spatial development, distinct and identifiable neighborhoods, and a very diverse population spanning a wide range of ethnicities, cultures, social classes. They provide a more compact setting than the metropolis, yet with all these complex issues that face the 21st century cities, cities such as Antwerp are a valuable setting for experimenting with social housing, with public spaces and collective projects, and in so doing, to rethink what the city means today. Antwerp's historical development is still present in the urban fabric today. It has highly distinct neighborhoods, such as the Diamantwijk, famous for its large Orthodox Jewish community, Linker Oever, a Corbusian area of high rises just across the river de Scheldt. Its compact area is a mere eighth of London, and it includes former industrial areas and harbors, a fashion industry, a world-famous cathedral, many museums, and a university with over 20,000 students, just to name a few key features. Since the post-war years, Antwerp, as well as much of Flanders, has also been faced with very complex questions of disurbanization. The federal government encouraged people to build their own homes, often in the periphery. And some of its neighborhoods, such as Luchtbal, might qualify as what has recently been called an arrival city, an area where migrants gather as a starting point for integrating into the city. Economic disparity has increased in the last 20 years, and the uneven development of the city raises questions of social cohesion that are increasingly important to its future. As such, the contrasts and contradictions present in the city fabric, the historical urban structures, the contemporary architectural interventions, they all provide a broad palette of urban conditions, which in turn embody fundamental questions of what we wish the city to be, how we want to live together, and what is needed to shape a socially viable future. So for this conversation, we've invited three people to focus on a few particular elements in this field: the issue of housing in relation to urban policies in the market, the role of architecture in forging community, and the importance of bringing unheard voices into these networks. Our three speakers, who I'm very happy to have here today, each take a different perspective on these aspects, and I will introduce them all three in order first, and then hand the floor to them. First, I'd like to introduce Malliet, who has been with the Office of the Flemish Government Architect for many years as a project leader, project coordinator. And she will talk about about alternatives to current urban housing developments in Antwerp. Second, we'll have Saar Meechank, founding partner of De Hoog en Meechank Architects of Ghent, who will talk about co-housing from the architect's perspective in terms of design and collaborations between architects and inhabitants. And then finally, Sarah Elubnani, a PhD candidate in sociology from the University of Antwerp, who will discuss ways of bringing the unheard voices into the city, into its institutional processes and structures in order to ensure the individuals and communities that might otherwise go unseen take part in creating this social fabric. So with that, I would like to first give the floor to Malliet for her presentation.
Thank you very much, Lara. So I wanted to speak to you about building groups, Baugruppen, and cooperatives, Genossenschaften, as possibilities that could help solve our housing crisis in Flanders we have today. The middle class in Flanders has the tradition of building their own homes. That is why people say here that we are born with a brick in our stomach. After World War II, the Belgian government had a housing policy that stimulated private home ownership. That was by the Act de Taille. They subsidized families for the construction of their own homes. That law did not miss its effect, especially in rural municipalities. There, cheap building land was widely available. Over 20 years, no fewer than 400,000 new homes were built. Of course, these homes were single family, mostly detached houses. And of course, this was only made possible by the government providing also railway infrastructure and cheap train fares. And later on, when the cars became more affordable, roads and highways. Today, we know that the model of the single-family home is not very future-proof. Single-family housing is extremely space-consuming, and it's one of the main causes of our traffic jams. The problems of climate change, biodiversity, water management, and the need for energy, of course without fossil fuels, urge to change housing policy. The individual owner model also does not provide an answer to the changing demographics, to smaller and more one or two person households. It has become impractical for elderly individuals to continue living in their own family home as it becomes too large and too far away from goods and services or from elderly care. This implies we will have to build more collective housing in well-equipped centers, in cities, in villages. There are not too many solutions to ensure that this can be affordable. Baugruppen, such as those that are active in Berlin, provide a sustainable answer to the desire to design one's own home, not as a single-family home, but as a multi-family home. Multi-family housing is a necessity in an urban environment. There we don't need individualized but joint commissioning. By creating our own homes and living environments in urban areas, we also help shape cities in a sustainable way. Self-Made City is the title of a book about Berlin Baugruppen. Baugruppen are in line with the fantastic history of European cities. They are the result of generations of human hands over centuries. In Belgium, the Act de Taille resulted in a democratization of home ownership. We have a very large number of private homeowners. In 2018, this was 72%. The share of private tenants was 19%, and the share of social tenants only 7%. Of course, this is an average because in cities, social tenants tend to be 10 or a little bit more than 10%. Of course, in cities where the land was not as affordable, housing companies built collective housing. Therefore, the Act Brunfaux in 1949 was passed, aiming at the lowest income categories. That was the start of social housing production by the government. Today, we are again in great need of social housing. In Flanders, we have about 250,000 social homes, and today there are almost as many families who are in need of one. The last 2 decades, the Flemish government attempted to build more social housing, but the production does not speed up. The scaling up of social housing encounters resistance. That is due to the fact that big social housing projects have often led to a segregation of people that are poor and in need. This leads to social problems, to difficult neighborhoods. That is why social housing in Flanders, the projects are become smaller and smaller and more dispersed. But that does not help to speed up the production of new dwellings. We need to look for a policy model that counteracts social segregation in housing. That makes it possible to realize larger housing projects where social tenants and middle class live together in a mix that is somehow more average to society. That is exactly what in Zurich the cooperatives are achieving. In Zurich, housing cooperatives offer their members affordable housing in the city. They realize large projects in the city that are climate friendly, more space efficient, and they rent them out at cost price. A housing cooperative is, in its simplest form, an organization of citizens who unite in a company to realize their housing needs together. The members acquire a share in the housing cooperative and are therefore co-owners. The cooperative resident has a residential rights and therefore has security of living in one of the apartments. He cannot live his whole lifetime in the same, but adapted to his needs and family size. The cooperatives, or the Genossenschaften as they are called in German, offer affordable, climate-friendly living for the middle class in the city. The city of Zurich facilitates the cooperative model by offering building plots on leasehold for 60 to 90 years. In return, the city of Zurich demands that the share of the housing project is rented out as social housing, and they subsidize them. In a project, the percentage will always be less than 25%. This is how they knit the social mix. The housing market in Zurich is very different from ours. 90% of the homes are rental properties. But lately, the housing cooperative model is experiencing a real revival. In 2011, a referendum in Zurich determined that the city must facilitate this formula so that there is a share that can grow from now 1/5 to later on 1/3 of the housing market. In 2019, they celebrated their centenary by building an entire neighborhood from the ground up. You know the project as More Than Housing. These Genossenschaften are also pioneers in sustainable construction. They apply ecological and energy efficient construction methods, install heat networks on residual heat or geothermal energy. They innovate by offering new housing types, such as cluster housing, suitable for the Zurich households, of which today half contains only one person. They know affordability and sustainability can match, as in most projects, there is no underground car parking. But then they know how to make life without a car comfortable by well-equipped bicycle sheds in the buildings. Some of them are on the floor of the building with bicycle lifts to get near or even into your apartment with your bike. In addition to affordable housing, they also offer their tenants facilities, such as community spaces, guest houses, studio spaces, space for co-working, shared cars, rental bicycles, and they even provide low rent space for facilities they want to make a lively neighborhood, for instance, a bakery or a restaurant. To me, these two models, the Baugruppen in Berlin and the Genossenschaften in Zurich, are worth looking into closely. They provide answers to social issues, to housing issues, to climate issues that our property-based housing policy cannot answer. Because today we should no longer realize our dream house individually, but in group. Preferably not within the boundaries of our own plot, but within the boundaries of the planet. I thank you.
It's kind of special to be crossing scientific fields here as a sociologist, but I'm very pleased to be here. As you stated in your introduction, or maybe I should first introduce myself. So my name is Lara Schrijver. I'm a sociologist, PhD in sociology at the Department of Sociology at the University of Antwerp. I'll be talking about how, as you mentioned, some voices are being excluded from institutional processes and structures very broadly. Maybe to give a brief context, my own research on organizational diversity management, and it looks into the ways that diversity is defined and shaped in organizational context. So what does it mean for organizations to be diverse? So I look into the discourses and strategies that institutions use and what these mean for ethnic minorities, in my case, what they mean for them who are the subject of these discourses and strategies. And Antwerp is really an interesting city to look into how different voices can be heard, as the city has, I think, about an estimated 180 different nationalities. But sadly, these numbers, when we look at the numbers, we see that ethnic minority groups, they're largely overrepresented in unemployment and in so-called lower skilled jobs, which means that for many organizations that ethnic minorities are faced with a sort of occupational segregation, and hence they're largely underrepresented in positions of leadership and power. And this is especially the case in Antwerp. And of course, I think, as we all know, that disadvantage is inevitably connected with disadvantages on the housing market, which is becoming more and more visible in the city, where housing prices are continually increasing. So speaking in very broad terms here, I think we can state that in this specific urban context, certain lives are much more vulnerable than others. And obviously the lives of minority groups are being affected. But this also has big implications for the way that institutions work and the different voices that are being heard in the city and within these institutions. And I'm talking now about ethnic minorities because they face multiple forms of exclusion. But there's obviously also an important gender aspect to institutional spaces. And I think I can assume that this is also the case in architecture. They're often portrayed as neutral, while in the reality, they're not only very racialized, but they're also very gendered. And with diversity becoming sort of a natural part of the city, it's almost evident that diversity is being reflected in these institutions. And I think the past years, for many institutions, diversity, the talk about diversity has grown. And I think past year, the Black Lives Matter movement was a sort of catalyst for institutions to think and work around these diversity issues. So let's see your back. So there are two ways to manage this diversity, which I would like to briefly elaborate. And maybe to make it a little more concrete, with diversity, I refer to the characteristics of people that are often symbolically meaningful in relationship with others, such as their age, their gender, religion, ethnicity, and so forth. So I think a first way to manage diversity is described as a mainstream or a business approach to diversity, where it's kind of regarded as a sort of corporate multiculturalism. And so you bring in different people as a means to introduce a broader range of perspectives and a broader range of ideas, which could then contribute to more innovation and competitive advantage. So I think what this means in the context of architecture and housing is that you would employ a diversity of people to incorporate alternative ideas, but it's really for commercial ends. And what happens is that diversity kind of becomes an instrument for organization. It's commercialized. And despite that, this way of looking at diversity is actually very dominant in a lot of sectors and organizations, the pitfall behind this performative way of using diversity is that certain individuals and communities are actually being instrumentalized. So different voices are not really being heard. They're just there as a sort of quantifiable indicator for institutions. And nothing is really said about the social and institutional change or structural mechanisms that are disadvantaging certain groups above others. So I think this during my talk may become a little more concrete. And then there's a second way of thinking about diversity or managing diversity, which gained a lot of attention since the 90s, and it tries to look at that institutional diversity from a sort of social justice perspective. And the central argument is that not institutions and their interests should be central when it comes to diversity, but institutional diversity should really be about moving certain power dynamics which leave voices unheard and oppressed at different levels. So from that perspective, individuals are no longer reduced to a part of minority group that are seen as different. And I think the reason why this is so important is that when institutions, be it in higher education or in architecture, when they focus on attracting the most qualified candidate, there will also be dominant norms and values being imposed on certain minority groups, be it women or ethnic minorities or other minority groups. And I think, and I'm speaking as a non-expert here, so correct me if I'm wrong, that the traditional focus in architecture in creating the look and the making of buildings, it's not, I don't think it's a neutral environment, because it's always constructed around a clearly defined norm, and probably that of a white, middle higher class male and able-bodied male. So that standard, it acts as the basis of the structures of certain institutional processes, and it determines the characteristics, it determines the content, the rules of the sector, and also the output, so how the social fabric of the city looks like. And the output is one thing, of course, but obviously that norm also defines who gets a voice, who is being seen in the community. And I saw the lecture of Pascal Sablon, for example, speaking about Black architects and how they're rarely visible. And when they are visible, they're constantly being spoken to and about as people of color and not as architects. So when most people who are not an expert in the field, also like me, when they think about architects, we often think about white males, and maybe one exception is maybe Zaha Hadid, is a famous name many a non-expert, I think, know. But by defying dominant norms, by putting into question those traditional methods, the ethics of the sector, you're really broadening the norms and competencies of what it means to be a great architect, and you include other voices. And I suppose we're going to talk about this later too, but I read a little about the Spatial Agency and all-inclusive engagement in architecture. And I think that these initiatives are very interesting because they seek for alternative ways of organizing by not only broadening norms and competencies on what it means to be an architect of something, but also by introducing a social justice perspective to making a city. And my own research, which is in nonprofit organizations, shows that despite the fact that nonprofit organizations are often seen as inherently good, they often make use of a kind of business discourse when talking about organizational diversity. They're kind of instrumentalizing the bodies of minorities in their organization for their organizations. And this happens everywhere. So I think for me, it's very interesting to see how initiatives like the Spatial Agency, how small that they may be, that they're actually centralizing the fostering of equality, be it directly or indirectly through more socially embedded networks, such as is done by the agency. And by doing that, it really just defies the traditional ways of doing architecture. And I think to finish off, I think one of the things that critical scholars really emphasize is when you think about diversity, about bringing in different voices, about defying what is supposedly neutral, you should also realize that it is first and foremost a need for an institutional commitment to change the organization. And enabling change or enabling action, it really requires that it is associated with histories of struggle and really with discussions about social justice. And so often institutions, and I see this in very different kinds of settings, in different kinds of sectors, instead of working with communities, they tend to use these communities to transform the organization with the same rules and the same methods, not realizing that those rules and those methods are in fact not neutral. They are the tools with which the voices of certain groups are being silenced. So I think the main challenge for many of us is to think about how we can think outside of the norms we are educated in, because that's very difficult, and also actively work towards making voices visible without reducing those voices to their minority status, so to speak. So thank you.
And thank you. So we've already actually discussed the issue of climate justice in a way that's been incorporated in the building groups, and social justice that might also, this kind of social balance that can be fostered in building cooperatives. And I think a voice like this about the diversity and inclusion of groups that might not be the first on the list that one would think about when setting up a cooperative is an extremely valuable addition to how we might think about housing in the future. Now, I hope that we can go to the presentation on co-housing in Ghent to see how this actually works on, in real life.
So this project is located on the outskirts of Ghent. We call it Ghentbrugge. The motorway is very close by, and therefore it forms a strong acoustic nuisance. Probably that's why the terrain stays free for a long period. At first, the residents were sought by a co-housing project. That's an institution that guides residents in such processes. The project developer Bostoen, he owned the land and he was part of the residents group. The competition was held, after which Team Kampvuur, consisting of the architectural firm Denkstudio and Doge en Meegank, of which I am part, was appointed as the winner. So here we see the competition image with the location of the residential buildings and the pavilion. The project is not a prototype of dense urban living. At the end, I also reflect on some critical shortcomings in this project. Nevertheless, I would like to take you through the project on the basis of some guiding thoughts that can be transposed to other urban developments. The co-housing project has 28 housing units, supplemented by a collective pavilion. This includes, among others, a laundromat, workshop, dining room, kitchen, guest room, play corner, relaxation room, co-working space, and a library. We started with a team of 8 residents. The other residents stepped into the project further in the process. The first members, therefore, went through the architectural process intensely with us, the architects, while the last residents bought a ready-made home. The entrance is provided with a parking cluster, so the actual site is therefore fully car-free. Priority is given to soft mobility, and by arranging the houses according to the contours of the terrain, they are giving a private garden on the other edge, and a collective inner garden is maximized. This setup was also analyzed on the basis of acoustic measurements. 3 things have been very decisive and guiding in our thinking and design. The first is creating a table as a metaphor for the community. The second is introducing a conscious gradient between collective and private. And the third is giving space to identity. So the first, as Hannah Arendt also points out, the importance of a central place, the table, to come together, to discuss, to act, to inspire, to reflect is crucial in the functioning of a community. Even in a co-housing, however small, this importance cannot be underestimated. Here we have created an interior and exterior space that both fulfill that role. The pavilion, which stands as the volume in the circle of the residential volumes, and the outdoor space centrally located between the residential units and connecting, but also separating elements between the private houses. Here you can see the construction site with the pavilion and the entrance, and the residential blocks surrounding the central garden. The second focus was introducing a conscious gradient between collective and private. Because when people live together more densely or shared, it is incredibly important to keep an eye on the separation or transition from collective to private. So the importance of the intermediate place and gradient is unmistakable. There is a step-by-step transition from the central landscape zone to the house, first by introducing a slightly more wild elevated garden zone, and by creating in the end an antichambre in front of the houses. Here we have used the archetype of the porch. A porch is an intermediate place where the private and the collective merge. It gives space to a private place with a view on the collective. The boundary and the change in height shows that this space can only be entered when the private residence gives an invitation. At that moment, it tilts towards a place of encounter and being together, on a smaller scale than in the pavilion or the central garden. At the rear of the houses, there is a small private garden so that retreat is also possible. The last one is giving space to identity, because living in a community may not take away the experience and the sense of one's own identity. Customizing a place is purely human and deserves full respect, even in collective forms such as housing or a city. In order to make coexistence feasible, it is clear that a certain amount of guidance must be given. Creating frameworks is important here. In the design process, we initiated subtle differences between the houses, for example, different colors of jointing, gray, dark gray, and green, and a keystone at the top between the transition of the houses with a vertical shadow line. We also give the client a spectrum of choices in which the personalization of the house was possible. The choice to have a concrete bench in the facade of the house, or to have a high or a low window at the porch sides. The choice to have colored skylights at the front door or not, and the choice to have different types of jointing. Of course, these are small keys, but together with the identity that grows around the house by inhabiting it, nevertheless form an important aspect. The porch is a connecting line through these characters. Some final thoughts I have about this project. The density of this project is not high. It's a very spacious site with only 28 units on 12,000 square meters. So this is clearly a situation that can only exist on the outskirts of a city and not an urban model. Secondly, we see that this project reaches people of different age, but it clearly asks an elitist audience because of the price. The units cost about 300 to 400,000 euros, VAT excluded. So in this way, it remains a strong monoculture of people with the same conviction and kind of background. Personally, I think we should work on projects that are much higher in density, located in the city and where there's a strong and diverse and flexible habitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So we've got quite a number of different perspectives on this. What you are describing in your project is an engagement with these future inhabitants that allows at least those from the beginning of the process to make their own choices and also help think through what it means to them to have these encounters in these collective spaces. But as you also point out, it is still a quite exclusive project, which in some ways the suggestion of the Baugruppen and the Genossenschaften, these kind of cooperatives, have at least the potential, if not yet the reality in Flanders, of allowing for both kind of technological and building innovations, but also maybe clientship innovations. The idea that one could engage with that Belgian notion of forming one's own housing space, but for a very wide range of potential new owners. I wanted to actually talk about briefly, maybe first, this issue of housing security is beginning to come up a few times. You described it also in part as the impossibility at this point to be able to live in the city without quite some funds or without being on a long wait list for social housing. And Sarah, you also mentioned these economic disadvantages that are excluding people. Is housing security something that is also part of that field? The difficulty of actually being able to live in the place you work?
Yes, I think it is something we should think about as a government and as a social housing companies, because yeah, that's what it's all about. If you have in city centers a good mix of diversity of population, then you need affordability. And at the moment in Antwerp, in the south, in the new housing projects on the south and even on the island, there is an aiming at mixing social housing in the master plan.
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite nice, I think. But it has to be done like that, and that is. There were some problems in law at the moment, because we had a Front and Pandan decree who was forcing developers to make an amount of social housing in their projects, and that has been fought and been how do you say, the law isn't working anymore. So that's indeed a very important thing to do.
So there's less of a commitment to social housing within the development. At least there's no legal commitment right now. It's an intention, but not a reality anymore.
Social housing firms have their own land, and that's where the segregation is starting, of course. They build the housing there on their land, and then you get to those arrival cities. They are renovating their projects too, but they are not gaining any better social mix by that, I think.
No, I agree. I think I was recently reading an article, and I think I was shocked by the numbers to hear that. I think in Antwerp, it's like 30% of lower income families. And then when you look at Flanders, there's 7%, like you said, of social housing, which is a very large discrepancy. And I think what happens then is that you get the people who can't or are not in the system of social housing, they get pushed out on the private market, and they pay way too much for qualitative or for very low qualitative housing. And I think, I don't know about I don't know how, I wouldn't have any answer how to solve it, of course, but I think that's a very real problem. And it also, and from my own perspective, it affects a lot of ethnic minority communities here in Antwerp, who are often drawn to the city because of a lot of advantages in terms of transport and work. But they're in very much a vulnerable position when it comes to affordable housing and qualitative housing, mostly.
Yes, in Groonkwartier in Antwerp, the former military hospital, there the law was still acting, and there is social housing mixed together, and people see the green kwartier, the Groonkwartier, as a very highbrow environment, but it is not, because there is an amount of social housing in it, and you even don't see the difference in the architecture. So it's
Yeah,
quality way of living, I think.
yeah, but when I was still a student, I did a little project on Groonkwartier, and it just started. Then the first inhabitants started living there, I think, for like 3-4 years, and by now I think the first inhabitants started living here in 2011, and we did a little project, a little research on the site, and you're right, there is in theory there's like this social mix, but like you said, it's really seen as a very gentrified and highbrow neighborhood, and I think when you look at it sociologically, there's really not a lot of interaction with the lower income communities who live in the social housing. And one of the things I remember from the project, and which I've really found very interesting, is you have the green quarter, which is literally almost a square, and you have the social housing on the side, but the income or the entrance of the social housing is on the outside of the quarter. Does everybody understand what I'm trying to say? Because it's a little complex to, you have to visualize, like the entrance is on the outside, and all the middle class and higher class apartments and lofts are really inside the square. So there's like this really physical distance between those communities. And I really, when I came there and we did the project, I found it a really sad conclusion, like to see how, in theory there is a social mix because you have those communities living close to each other, but they're like in reality they're not living that close to each other. There's really a clear distinction about who is part of that little community there. We talked to the architecture in that project, and he really couldn't give a clear answer to why that was done. He said, well, you have to ask the housing corporation, but the social housing corporation, and the social housing corporation was like, we didn't have anything to say in that. So it was really kind of a vague answer. So even when there's a social mix, I think you have to take in account a lot of other factors that really can create a social mix, because it's
I do think that in the Groonkwartier there is a second block on the inside, but it's probably perhaps right. There is one on the street side and one on the inside, but of course, and that's why I love what cooperatives in Zurich do, because there you don't even see where the social house, which of the apartments is the social one. You can't see it. You live in the same building, then take the same steps and go up and down. So there is a possibility to encounter and to meet, and that is because that's because they offer those housing low cost price, not. And the cooperative is a very different economical model. They don't want to make financial profit, they want to make social profit or environmental profits, and that's a very other way to think, and that's why I think I like it very much. I don't know how in Zurich how the averages are and how newcome inhabitants are mixed in those projects. I don't have the numbers. I don't, but it's very mixed in the project. There is one project of housing on top of tram depot. What do you call it? The public tram shelter. On top of it, there are dwellings. And in that concept. There are people who are new in the city, and there are even millionaires who are living there. So it's an extreme mix, I think.
But it also, I mean, what I like about how you're describing it is also it suggests a very different idea about what it means to live somewhere, which is about a community and about being together, and not so much about an investment, which I think has been part of the urban discussion in the last 20, 30 years. Certainly, there have been many cities who have followed along with this idea of Richard Florida's creative class, that if you can just get the artists going and the knowledge workers in, then the city will bloom. But it forgets in a way what the foundation is of the city, which is difference and diversity. And I do think, Sarah, you were in fact critiquing your own project in terms of lack of density. That, of course, is a very urban condition. But the idea that one would base a project around meeting spaces. I mean, this is also what Anne is discussing in those co-ops, that you're always meeting each other. And maybe that's one of the potentials that we can kind of see. Certainly in Antwerp, I think there should be much more space possible for not segregating paths and streams, but allowing people to kind of cross paths with one another.
Yeah, that's really true, because, well, you can do it in a mathematical way, that you say there is a percentage of, for example, social housing or low cost, or and you can put it together. You can also put it into volumes or translate it into architecture. But I think the biggest challenge, or the thing that we architects or everybody needs to address, is how to create space where people really interact. And that doesn't mean that they have to sing together or anything like that. I mean interaction as a way as living together, having those small connections, having large connections. And I think that creating emptiness is as important as creating volume as being an architect, because it is indeed, as Sarah and Anne also quoted, it's about those little pathways. It's about taking the same entrance. It's about having little or large spaces that are located in very interesting places, so that you have the idea that there is a kind of community that kind of grows above the mathematics of we should put this and this and this kind of people together. Putting it together is something else than making it work. And that's really a big challenge, but I think it can be obtained with in very subtle ways, like those little things about entrances and as we already talked about, but also how do you think about a city? Is there enough place, as Anna Arendt also says, are there places that stay free and also unprogrammed? I think that we don't program every vacant space, so that things can aroused and people can start something, that people can meet, but in a kind of free and not programmed or not artificial way. But that's a great difficulty, I think, in architecture. Yeah, and I'm also always very critical on my own things I create as an architect, because I think you should stay very critical in aiming for better. And I think if when I listen, and also the things I know about the Bau group and the idea about it's not about ownership, it's that social and that focus on environment and on social ideas, that's something completely different. And I think we should kind of take that in as Belgians and European people, because that's such a beautiful thing, and that's the starting point. Before even architecture, it's really the starting point, is the attitude, is the idea about how we are going to live together. And yeah.
Quite frankly, that sounds like a closing comment already in a beautiful way. We could also consider a few other conditions, I think, but in some ways, closing on the idea of how we live together seems like a nice way to round off. I really do hope that the city of Antwerp will take more of the opportunities it has, and I really appreciate your contributions on this from the different perspectives. Plenty of challenges to be facing in the coming years, so hopefully we can contribute our small architectural and policy thoughts to that. So thank you.
At Brickworks van der Moortel, we make high-quality bricks, slips and clay pavers in unique colors and sizes. To support architects around Europe and the UK, we created a brand new high-end brick lab, housing the latest in ceramic innovations. Built on more than 150 years of experience, we bring together tradition with the architecture of tomorrow. Every brick, slip and clay paver in our brick lab is part of a research and development program creating new knowledge and insights. Working together with architects, we can thus reach higher levels of sustainability, quality and circular solutions, combining them with the highest design standards of today. All this without losing our passion that we would love to share with you.